Hi, this is session 6 where we're going to be talking about curriculum approaches, and it's important to think about how theory and practice come together in curriculum approaches and pedagogy. So this is about the way we view teaching and learning and how this impacts our work and in turn children's experiences. So hopefully you will start to think about the type of experiences you want for children in early childhood services that you work for. Chapter 7 is the prescribed textbook reading for this session. So there are different theories about early childhood that inform our approaches, and we also can draw on a range of perspectives in our work. So if we define perspectives, this is the way something is seen, or the meaning of perspective in this context will have something to do with the looking or viewing, the way you take a particular stance on something. So from theories, there's sets of assumptions that are formed about how young children learn and develop, and what learning and teaching could and should look like. So these assumptions influence the way educators think and act, and they have an impact on the ideas and beliefs that educators have. So we should just unpack the terminology of pedagogies again. It's a word that you'll become familiar with, but sometimes it takes ages for it to really sink in. But all the deliberate actions and processes that educators organise and implement to translate philosophy and approaches to curriculum into practice can be seen as pedagogies. And educators need to select pedagogies to put their approaches to curriculum into practice. So in other words, to translate philosophy into practice. There are also implicit theories and naive beliefs that are part of early childhood education. And this is because some educators have deeply embedded beliefs or taken for granted viewpoints, which we'll call silent narratives, where they haven't actually looked and considered particular things. And in this case, it can constrain the practices of those educators and ultimately experiences for children. So this tells us that it's really important to examine beliefs, values, and identify biases, and to consider post-structuralist and critical theories to interrogate if we do have silent narratives. There's a reading provided on Canvas where you may like to look more closely at the journal article that's talking about this. But I have some examples. So there are early childhood educators who often find it difficult to meaningfully include Aboriginal education as part of their program, for example. And these silent narratives may come through because of the fact that they think, oh, we have no Indigenous families, there's no need to address that in curriculum. It could be through lack of knowledge, fear of getting it wrong, individual and institutional racism. However, there are many resources that assist in our educational work. So the Victorian Early Years Learning and Development Framework would be a good resource to use. And I know if you're not in Victoria listening to this, it could be that there's perspectives that come through in different state curriculum frameworks. There is reference to Indigenous educational perspectives within the ELF, but the Victorian framework has been revised in 2016 and has a stronger emphasis now today on Indigenous perspectives. So it's covering a framework for all children. It recognises and respects Aboriginal cultures and their unique place in the heritage and future of Victoria. And learning about and valuing the place of Aboriginal people will enhance all Victorian children's sense of place in our community is one of the statements. So it also includes an acknowledgement of country. So this should tell educators that they need to be addressing the perspectives within their curriculum. Here's some examples of my own practices from when I was teaching, where we invited Indigenous artists into the program and to create outdoor spaces that reflected Indigenous education, as you can see here, and also creating a pavement painting. And there are other ways where you can introduce Indigenous perspectives through storybooks, etc., and other resources like musical instruments. There are many ways, and we need to be looking at the curriculum framework and using guiding resources in how to do it rather than think it's too tricky, too hard, and just avoiding it. There are other ways we can question whether we have biases or beliefs. Here there's an example where I pose to you the question, should children engage with real-life meaningful issues? Some people would say it's too political, it's too hard to address issues such as war, homelessness or poverty with children, or anything in relation to refugees and asylum seekers. But I have a story to share here where you may like to look later at the CIVEX Memorial website, because this is a story where there were 300 people, adults and children, that drowned at sea in trying to get to Australia as asylum seekers. And my kindergarten and another friend's kindergarten decided we'd like to be involved in an art memorial project that was being constructed or erected at Canberra on the Lakes Burleigh Griffin land area, where there was an invitation that went out for needing about 300 poles to be decorated from different early childhood settings across, well, it wasn't really being an invitation to early childhood, but to primary and secondary schools to participate to create a memorial. And we asked if we could be involved and were told no, that the story was far too sad for preschool children to know about in relation to people that had been drowned at sea. So my friend and I contacted the committee that was involved with this project and reminded them that even preschool children often know the story of such things, because some of our families had been asylum seekers or refugees and had extended families that had been part of the story in trying to come to Australia as boat people. So we pointed out that many preschool children, if this is a story from their family background, that we felt it was okay for them to know about it. Once they considered our viewpoint, they thought, okay, you can be involved, which was fantastic because one of our fathers was actually an asylum seeker, and he had a fine art degree from Iran and was working as a bus driver. So he came and we had a group time with children and we talked about the story, and we asked children about what did they think they could do to be involved in relation to artwork that would be on the memorial pole. And some of them said things like, oh, we should put pictures of our faces on the pole so people will know that we're remembering that sad story of people who drowned. In the end, because my kindergarten was called Kookaburra Kindergarten, one child said we could put pictures of kookaburras on the pole, and that was a mutual agreement by all children. And they asked if the dad could paint, who was a fine artist, to paint the pictures of kookaburras for them, and that's what we did. So I think that's a good example of where children could know the stories. As teachers, you may need to tell the story very sensitively. I must truthfully admit that not all children were part of the group discussion, but children that we felt could be taken on board in a way that they would understand. And so it went ahead as a project. You may also think about the way educators question climate change. Some people probably avoid such issues, thinking it's in the too hard basket. Not everybody in the centre's on board with this. But if we think about defining sustainability, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, you might be passionate and have a strong viewpoint about it in relation to ensuring that such practices of environmental sustainability are embedded in your service. So I ask you to think about, what does it mean to you in relation to arts education? What values do you hold? I hear people talking about laminating things for art projects, and I would question, does it really need to be laminated? Is that a sustainable practice? But there would be other things too. Sometimes centres have worm farms, compost heaps, but they're not even used with children. They're sitting out in the playgrounds and not a part of daily embedded practices where the children could be taking responsibility to scrape their food scraps, for example, that go into the compost, or topping up or feeding the worm farm as part of a daily routine. Harvesting water that goes back out into the garden that's unused from lunch, etc. So if you think about sustainable art practices, we need to think about economics, the choices that we make that value resources, encouraging children to value things, maybe repairing equipment rather than discarding, cost savings that can be made by recycling, by using recyclable materials for art projects, making responsible decisions in the types of purchases made, in not using glitter, for example. All the glitter in the world is probably still here today, and how wasteful that might be as an art project. Thinking about use of polystyrene. All the polystyrene that breaks down is still here in our world today. So thinking about sustainably sourced natural materials to use as art projects would be important. Think about food for art use and the messages we sometimes give to children if we use food. Coloured rice, macaroni threading. These are not best practices nor appropriate to use as art resources. Important considerations need to be given to quality, culturally appropriate and environmental sustainable practices. I suggest that you consider learning outcomes. What are they if you were using such materials? And what materials could be used instead that provide the same outcomes? If an educator says, oh, we're using coloured rice for a sensory experience for the children to put their hands in, what other materials that are natural would provide the same learning outcomes? What are the messages we are giving to children when we use food? So here's an important quote which I can quickly read out for you. Using food as an art material, especially vegetables, is often a popular activity in many preschools. But I do not recommend using any type of food, says the author here, Carol Edwards, Linda Carol Edwards. Many children live at the poverty level, and for them, food is a prized commodity. When we use food as an art material, we give children the message that we do not value food for its precious nutritional value. In addition, children deserve to be given real art material and should not be put in a position of confusing art materials used to make art with things we eat. I hope that that is food for thought, so to speak, a pun on that. So different philosophies and approaches will inform the way we work, and they need to be incorporated into your practice to provide quality provision for young children. So hopefully those few perspectives that have just been shared about sustainable practices, food, Aboriginal perspectives within education will make you also think about your views and beliefs and whether there are naive assumptions or silent narratives. So we need to be clear about the philosophies that influence and inform our practice. There is a video posted on Canvas for you to watch by Colette Taylor. So think now about the important pedagogies that educators use. What does this reflect about the values and beliefs you'll consider for developing your own philosophy? If you think about which you would be using, what will you draw upon in your own practices? And that's something to think about perhaps after viewing this session. So think also about definitions of curriculum. Program and curriculum are quite different. I'll let you read this slide. So a good way to think about curriculum is that it's about everything that happens from the moment the child walks through the door. The ALF also tells us that curriculum encompasses all the interactions, experiences, routines and events, whether planned or unplanned, that occur. So if a child's walking through the front door and you are greeting them using their name, reminding them where to hang their belongings, you may have put their name next to a hook or in a closet. That has been intentional teaching to help a sense of belonging and identity, which is part of curriculum building. Curriculum approaches can be seen as adult-centred, child-centred, segregated, integrated, individual development, or the way you work building a community of learners. Sometimes it can be predetermined or emergent, transmission approaches, or constructivist. So if we look at these more closely, direct instruction curriculum is more like the Sesame Street approach, with where it's been dependent on the teacher. That is based on behaviourist or social learning theories. It relies a lot on rote learning. Socialisation curriculums based on maturationist theory. Reggio Emilia is an example where the children are required to direct their own learning, but there is some choice in the way they direct their own play. But collaboration between adults and children. Constructivist curriculums about when the teacher acts as a facilitator, a mentor, coach or partner in problem solving, and that's based on Piaget and Vygotsky's theories. Learning involves active participation between the child and the environment. So we need to think about these approaches. Ask yourself what type of approach you think is best and why. What was your best teaching moment and why? And if you've been on professional experience, you may think about what you observed, what you experienced while you were on your placement. Let's quickly revisit intentional teaching, which is about deliberate, purposeful, thoughtful decisions and actions. And also terms to understand about what child-guided means, which is the experience proceeds primarily along the lines of children's interests and actions, but teachers often provide materials and opportunities to support the child in facilitating. Adult guided can be experienced proceeds primarily along the lines of the teacher's goals. So it's really important to have a balance of both. It's about us, what we do. We plan curriculum based on intentional teaching together with children's emerging interests, using their voice as a guide. But it's also about those teaching moments that can occur through daily interactions, because it's these that provide opportunities for teaching moments. Research shows that a balanced approach is best because it's building on the child's abilities and interests. It's the way we can teach to build those dispositions we want them to have for lifelong learning. It also enables us to plan short and long-term goals. And it's about being involved with children. No matter what curriculum approach you use, it is most important to plan an environment where you will notice, recognise and respond to what you know and observe that's happening. Decision making that's based on your professional knowledge, where you use theory to be grounded in practice, where it's being reflected. When you're then documenting curriculum and what's going on, we need to make learning visible. Capture and explain your program and curriculum. Definition of an emergent curriculum is about the potential curriculum and documenting what happens rather than on pre-planned experiences. None of this sitting on a Friday thinking, oh, next week we might do macaroni threading. Goodness me, I hope not, because we haven't done it before. But it's not about pre-planning in that way. An emergent curriculum is about being non-linear, constantly evolving, collaborative, flexible and responsive, visible and balanced. In practice, in relation to documentation, it might be through mind maps, web diagrams, learning stories. It might include project work or involve small groups of children or large. And it could be short-term or ongoing. But project work often starts with something that may go on for days, but may become weeks or even months. Here's an example of a mind map. I'll let you peruse some of this. Webs. These can take many different forms, focusing on different pedagogies and context of those involved. Here's one where an educator has explored what might happen based on the theme of farm. And one on strawberries. So a child might pose a question and suddenly it becomes a project. It can spiral in many different forms and ways. ongoing learning. You may like to check out this example from a New Zealand service. And think about the National Quality Framework in regards to emergent curriculum. It tells us that each child's current knowledge, ideas, culture, abilities and interests are the foundation of the program, and where educators are responsive to all children's strengths, abilities and interests. So we need to have a commitment to play-based learning. That play-based learning is what will guide and support the skills and interests by you noticing, recognising and responding. Here's a possible format, thinking about what are you seeing from noticing about emerging interests, which might then lead to some intentional teaching for planned experiences. But there might also be that thinking when you're driving home from the end of the day, or where you've discussed with staff and shared your observations, and you start to think more long term, what might be the future possibilities and where this might lead to? Or it could be that you want to plan an excursion or incursion. Here's another video that's been posted. I'll leave you to read about the project approach and what that entails. This is about inquiry-based learning, where perhaps a child has posed a question, wants to know something, and that question might lead to investigation and research between staff and children or the whole community. I sometimes used to find it really handy to have what I call a wondering wall, even if it was a whiteboard, where a question that a child might have asked could be posed up there for the whole community to see. Sometimes that led to families investigating and researching responses to the child's question, contributing back into the curriculum. Here's an example where children did do some inquiry learning as a project, where they had a mini landfill for educational sustainability, bearing a number of items. So you can see the signs that the children have created. So there's literacy there, numeracy, in relation to the children would dig up every few days or weeks and investigate whether things had decomposed, what stages they were at, what happened to the things that they had buried, glass, tin, paper, cardboard, even polystyrene. So they became little researchers. The children's ideas were documented, so this became an ongoing project where it went on for a number of weeks into months. Jenkins advocates a teacher-facilitator approach for effective EFA. S stands for Education for Sustainability. This occurs when the teacher establishes the learning environment so that it responds to children's needs and interests by paying attention to materials and interactions, ensuring these are appropriate. So this approach aligns with Education for Sustainability as it provides children with opportunities to examine possibilities for change. McNaughton and Williams describe teacher facilitators as encouraging independent learning and discovery. So the argument in this project is that teacher facilitator style, rather than a teacher as a leader one, is necessary for a transformative project approach. So The mini landfill was a balance of child-led and adult-led learning. So imagine you've observed an ongoing interest in baby animals presented to a group of children through dramatic role play. Try using a concept map or web for yourself. Think about potential questions for investigation, what experiences or activities you might plan, and have a bit of a practice or exploration, and that will build your understanding and skill in doing some mind mapping or web design for the way you might document curriculum. So enjoy doing that after this session finishes. Spend a few minutes thinking about it. See what ideas you come up with. So to conclude, think about curriculum approaches in this session and what resonates with you through your own personal views and values and why, and which relevant pedagogies could be useful to you to consider further. Thanks for listening.